This video is going to go over the different senses and talk about the relationship between those senses and our emotional response, like which ones are best suited to creating emotional response and which ones you have to be more intentional about it. So the information in this mostly comes from a book called Thank You for Arguing by Jay Heinrichs. It comes from chapter 24, which is called Use the Right Medium. So I'm taking some ideas that he does as he goes through and talks about whether each sense is more emotional or logical in nature, but I'm also adding on to that and giving you some examples of different kinds of uses. So we're just going to go through each sense and then talk about it as an emotional or logical effect. So touch. There are logical uses for the sense of touch. For instance, if you are trying to figure out if some fruit is ripe, you could pick it up and kind of squeeze it and see if it's soft, and if that means it's right time to eat it, then you eat it. And it gets a logical response in your mind. That information is interpreted logically. But more of the time, touch is more of an emotional sense. And so when we, pet our dog or cat or whatever other kind of animal we have, we get an emotional response from that, and so do they. Kids' toys very often are soft and is a comforting sort of sensation and texture for kids, so they're made that way to get that emotional response and comfort kids. So that's overall what touch is about. It's about emotion. It can be used for logical purposes, but it's mostly emotional. That's a sense of smell. Again, you can use it for logical purposes. For instance, you might be trying to figure out if your milk is still good or not, and so you might use the sense of smell to figure that out. You'll open it up and you'll smell it, and that will tell you in a logical way, is this gone sour or is it still good? But you might also experience an emotional response to some soured milk. It might kind of gross you out. And overall, that is what sense is more likely to inspire, is an emotional response rather than a logical one. For instance, if you smell chocolate chip cookies baking, probably your first response is going to be one of emotion. I would say most people probably have positive associations with it, and so it'll stir up positive emotions for you. Some people might have some baggage related to chocolate chip cookies, or some emotions that it stirs that are more negative, and so it might be a negative response. But generally, the sense of smell is going to get an emotional response first. It might be logical as well, but overall it's emotional. And the same is true of the sense of taste. So again, you can use taste for logical purposes. For instance, if you are trying to figure out if the milk has gone bad and you didn't take the time to smell it, you'll find out really quickly if you taste it, if it has gone sour, and that will be giving your brain logical information, though it still may gross you out, which is an emotional response. Maybe tasting peppermint candies might remind you of times you were growing up and hanging out with grandparents at church, and they were, passing you peppermint candies to keep you quiet and keeping you from being a distraction. And you might have some emotional response to that. And if you eat a peppermint candy now, it might stir up those emotions. Generally, most food is emotional in the way that we respond to it. We, think it's good, we think it's bad, but sometimes it's based on past experiences or associations with who makes it, or it just tastes really good. And that is an emotional response, too, of, man, this is delicious. A really experienced chef or baker might also use taste for logical purposes. They may taste something and be like, that needs more of this, because they are very knowledgeable about it and their brains can respond also logically to taste. Most of us, though, it stays in that emotional realm for us. So these first three are all generally emotional in nature, and they're likely to trigger emotional responses in the audience. When we get to sound and sight, it gets a little bit more complicated. So first, when we talk about sound, we can talk about language, even if it's not being said out loud. Language is still sound-based. It's us recording language that is naturally out loud, and a lot of people, when they read, are hearing the words in their head. So there's still a sound component. When you only have words, like if Siri is saying something to you or Alexa is saying something, you have the words which give you the information, but you don't have tone to convey how to take it. So language itself is a very logic-based system. You put these sounds together and it equals this word. This word represents this. You put these words in this order and they mean this. All of that is a very logic-based system. And so when you only have the words, you only have logic. You may have experienced at some point sending a text message that was misunderstood because it didn't have the tone. You could say thanks, but the word thanks by itself means thanks. But then if you put the wrong punctuation after it, if you put a period or you put, ellipses, or you don't punctuate at all, someone might take that as you're upset with them when you did say thanks. But lacking tone, they might read into it. And on the other hand, lots of exclamation points and a smiley face or something like that shows that you really mean it and it's really conveying the tone. But the word thanks by itself is just saying thanks. That's all it has to say until you're intentional about adding on to it. And so when you have only words, you have only logic. But you can add emotion with tone, so how we say it out loud, or adding words to convey tone in writing. Music is another emotional enhancer. So when we hear music, whether it's in a song or whether it's in a movie or anything along those lines, there's an emotional component. Generally, music gets an emotional response, and it's just like tone in speaking. So you have that mix of logic and emotion and sound, and you want to be aware of when you're likely to get one response or the other. And then with sight, it's also a mix. You can definitely convey logical information visually. So if you have charts and graphs, diagrams, and things like that, you're getting a logical response from your audience because you're conveying logical information, engaging the logical parts of their thinking. And you can also do the same thing if you ever have images that you put in a certain order to convey cause and effect. Once you introduce time to images, now you're making logical claims, or you're more likely to get a logical response. But images by themselves are where emotion comes from because it starts to create a sense of reality. So like this image here came from Wuhan, China in March of 2020. So it's the rest of the world is just starting to deal with the pandemic, but Wuhan's kind of, a few months in, and they've reopened some places. And so it's showing you what a lunch break in a factory is like post COVID-19 there. And while they're still obviously having to be cautious and take care of each other. So you can see they're all sitting here so far apart. You can get a sense of how isolating it could feel. You can actually see at least one of their faces pretty well, and you might start to wonder what that person's life is like. You might start to feel a connection with that person, but it makes the whole thing much more real and lets you have the chance to respond with emotion to the situation because you can see that it's a real thing. And that is where the emotional aspect of sight comes in. When we see stuff, it starts to become real to us, and that is what allows us to respond with emotion to information. So overall, the takeaways from this are that, first of all, when you only have words, like you're emailing or text messaging or something, you want to be really intentional about conveying tone so that you get the right emotional response from the audience. So remember that the words by themselves are only the information, and if you want people to know how you meant it and how they should respond to it, you may have to add, smiley faces if it's not super formal, or you might want to add extra words to something more formal to make sure that tone is present. When you're trying to create an emotional response, the closer you can get to reality, whether that's through visuals, actual visuals, or visual description, the more that you can either actually use smell, taste, and touch, or describe those senses and appeal to those senses through writing, the more you can convey tone either out loud or with facial expressions or adding words to help convey the tone, the more likely that emotional response is. So the closer you can get to recreating reality, and the senses are a big part of that, the more likely you are to get that emotional response from your audience. So whether you're working on a narrative or you're making an argument or anything along those lines, just be aware that those are some of the things that will help you get an emotional response from your audience, and you can use senses to do it.